Good evening. I'm Diane Sare, a LaRouche independent candidate against Chuck Schumer in 2022, and this is the New York Symposium, which I've been hosting now over several months. And I have with me this evening Dennis Speed, who is the moderator for the Manhattan Project, which was founded by Lyndon LaRouche actually in 2014, and a series of weekly meetings with Mr. LaRouche in 2015. And what we're going to be talking about today is the international drug trade. This is part of what's going on in the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan, probably why the British Empire is having their rug-chewing, garment-rending fits about what's happened. I will point out that thus far, it seems that the hysterical accounts in the American press are greatly exaggerated as thousands of Americans and others have been able to leave. And what you're going to be seeing today is some footage from speeches and comments made by Pino Arlacchi, who is formerly the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and who was the head of the Drug and Crime Office of the United Nations, and I understand is quite an expert on the mafia and international crime. So he has great authority. He's going to be talking about the Afghanistan situation specifically, which he knows a great deal about it with regard to the drug trade. And I will say, by the way, that these are comments publicly made. It in no way constitutes, as I always say, an endorsement of my candidacy for U.S. Senate. This is material that I am using that's available to the public to bolster a point that I would like to make about the international drug trade, which my opponent, Senator Chuck Schumer, has been supporting for decades in his role as the water boy for the Wall Street and City of London banks and the American intelligence agencies, which cover up these crimes. Now, to start, I'd like to show actually a function. Jose, if you could put LaRouche's triple curve up there. I've used this many times. It is extremely important. We just passed on August 15th, the 50th anniversary of Nixon's taking down the Bretton Woods system, where under intense pressure from the British, he decoupled the dollar from the gold reserve system so that you could say that little dot on the far left of the graph is about, I guess it says there, 1965 or so. After 1971, the amount of money in circulation began to have nothing to do with the actual physical economy, except in an inverse relationship, that more and more money was being printed, was being put into financial aggregates, the stock market, derivatives trading, that kind of thing. But the actual trade in physical goods and production of physical goods was collapsing almost in a mirror image. And when you get to a certain point in a hyperbolic function, you get a shock. You get a shock effect. And we really hit that in 2008. And then what did they do? They didn't put the system through bankruptcy reorganization as Lyndon LaRouche proposed, but they began printing more and more money. So I'm not going to get into bailout and bail in, which is here today, but just so people can see that. Thank you. That is where the drug trade comes in. And I'm going to borrow from a speech that was published in Executive Intelligence Review magazine back in 2011, the December 2nd issue, given by Viktor Ivanov, who was then the director of the Federal Drug Control Service of the Russian Federation. And he just gave a few examples. One, in terms of the devastation of what was produced. 2011 is 10 years after the US NATO occupation of Afghanistan. He said 1 year's output of Afghan heroin is sufficient to kill 10 million drug addicts. Think about that. He also said that analysis has shown that about 10 to 15% of the actual drugs being trafficked are intercepted, but less than 0.5% of the money associated with that drug trafficking is ever caught. And if you will now show figure 1 from his speech, he said, we have revealing official estimates made by Antonio Costa, the former Undersecretary General of the UN organization, that about 352 billion narco dollars were injected into major world banks to avoid critical shortages of liquidity. But he goes on to make the point, this is not a problem of individual banks, although there are many cases that can be cited like that of Wachovia or HSBC, but that this is actually completely systemic. And he says that it's estimated the amount of drug money flowing through the system is actually the same amount of money from the petroleum trade, oil and gas. Think about that. You can go to the next image here. So this shows you Ivanov's example. You can reflect on LaRouche's triple curve, the real economy being crushed by this financial soap bubble, as he calls it, which is illicit, it's speculation and it's drug money. And he has another diagram where he says the unsecured liabilities, which include this, are actually 10 times what are considered the secured liabilities. He said that the flows of dirty money of transnational organized crime, which is largely financed by drug money, is, and this is 2011, over $1 trillion annually, or 1.5% of the global GDP, and no less than 70% of this money goes through our banking system. He also reports that the amount of damage done to the economy, the cost of the damage from the problems of drug addiction, are double or triple the value of the drugs. So that while the US cocaine market is estimated at $35 billion and heroin and other drugs at $15 billion, the damage to the US economy from the drug trade itself is over $150 billion. And he cites one case of Wachovia Bank, which was caught in 2004 to 2007, laundering $378.4 billion of drug money, and they paid a fine of only $150 million. We know that when HSBC was caught, I believe, what year was that, Dennis? I don't know if you remember. When HSBC was caught, Loretta Lynch was the prosecutor and Eric Holder was the attorney general. So under Obama, what would that be, 2012?
Probably about 2012, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, they were caught laundering a mere $17 billion of drug money, and nobody went to jail. And when Eric Holder was asked, how come after this crash and everything that's occurred, you've never prosecuted, indicted even a single big banker? He said, well, we can't do that. The entire system would come down. So that's what you're dealing with. Bank of America similarly was caught. They tracked transactions related to sales of 22 tons of cocaine. Another case, 10 tons of cocaine. I think you get the idea. You can go to the last slide, Jose. He says that in his speech, it should be emphasized that the degree of impact of hydrocarbons, oil and gas on the global economy is common knowledge. They account for about 6% of the total world trade. The impact of the narcotics market, which is estimated at approximately the same size, is not looked at by economists and politicians, but the development at any rate, and he goes through, but he's saying that at this point, the narcotics market is about 6% of the world economy. I don't know if it is or is not, but it's certainly huge. You see here a map that he presented of the flow and production. Remember, these are 2011 figures of the international drug trade. Thanks. You can take that down now. So I just wanted to give you that as a little bit of an overview. And what I wanted to hear now is Mr. Arlaki. First, we're going to hear a short clip from his speech to a Schiller Institute conference on July 21st, of which Dennis Speed was the moderator, where he talks about the drugs in Afghanistan specifically.
Take the issue that mostly interests the Europeans, should interest, which is narcotic production. As you know, almost all heroin consumed in Western Europe comes from Afghanistan. And now I'm reading on several newspapers that the Taliban cannot leave the control of opium poppy cultivation because they live on it, which is absolutely wrong. It's not true. You have very good studies made by the United Nations, not only the Vienna program, but also the Security Council, on the real amount of money that you can skim from opium poppy production. And the figures are the following. The Farmgate production last year, we just got this data just a few months ago from the survey that the United Nations do every year. The Farmgate value of production of all opium poppy in Afghanistan was $350 million. $350 million, which was much reduced from a peak of 2010 that was more than $1.4 billion. So Farmgate production is a very small figure. That figure invited in the past many governments to consider the idea to buy the crop and impede the drug trafficking all over Europe. When this 350 million arrives in Europe, in the streets of Berlin, Rome, and Paris, their value is around 10 billion euros. So there is a huge interest of the Europeans to intervene. My plan at that time was to phase out all production in 10 years, 5 years, first eliminating production, 20% a year with an extremely small investment. At that time, the value of production was much less than today. But if we would like tomorrow, starting a plan in Afghanistan to eliminate opium production, we should invest, if we want 20% reduction a year, we should invest just $335 million, which doesn't mean, seems to me, an important figure. But you have to have an idea, and you have to have a plan, and you have to have a correct sense of the proportion and all the issues that are involved. Even if the Taliban would appropriate all Farmgate production, like a big cartel that buys all opium in the country, the most they can get is 250 million. The budget of the Afghan government, the living government, is around $80 billion. So if the Taliban will establish themselves as the government, they have at their disposal $8 billion to govern a country of 38 million people. All these figures does not impress me. They are not really figures that can impress any international investor. So we have now the total international aid in Afghanistan, in average, last 10 years, was around more or less 8 billion, more or less the entire budget of the government. So now, if we continue to invest in Afghanistan in a better way than in the past, the figure of international aid we did, we could achieve really substantial results. And when I say we, I say international community, all, not just USA and not just the Europeans who are the major investors. It has been until now the major international investors in Afghanistan. So we have now a big opportunity. We can seize this opportunity and start to make plans, or
I think rather than show the other, I'm just going to take this section from Mr. Arlaki, which is very jarring because he describes, and you have a sense from this, but he doesn't go through it explicitly, the tremendous success of his program prior to, in 2001, of eradicating the opium production in Afghanistan. He's being interviewed by Claudio Celani, and he's talking about a book, Against Fear, which is written in Italian. And Celani says, when you were at the UN, you succeeded almost in eradicating the entire opium production in Afghanistan. Is that true? And Arlaki said, yes. It was the Taliban who did it under our control and our pressure. When I started our mandate, I immediately went to Afghanistan and I tried to negotiate with them the elimination of a narcotic crop in the country. At the time, they basically controlled the whole country. In exchange for a long-term program of alternative development for Afghan farmers. My proposal was a 10-year program. They, the Taliban, proposed to do it in 1 year. And in exchange for all the money of the development plan, they gave it to them immediately. Then we started the long partner negotiations. There were different moments. At a certain point, I got tired of their behavior because they initially accepted the formal prohibition of narcotics production or poppy production, but then they started to bulk. So I asked the Security Council to do further sanctions, and basically describes the combination of a little bit of pressure, but also offering an alternative plan for economic development. He said by the summer of 2001, there was almost zero production of opium in the country because they decided to enforce the ban that they'd previously done under our advice. In that same year, in October, the United States invaded Afghanistan. And he says they completely destroyed their work and the plan. Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense at the time. He did personal negotiations, but not with the Taliban, but with the warlords that the United States was supporting. And he said to the warlords, we'll, quote, look the other way. I would say it was worse than that. You can go right back to producing your opium. So as Arlaki describes it, in virtually no time, he said our plan disappeared. And in just 2 years, the production of opium poppy in Afghanistan skyrocketed to a huge level and continued with a different moment until today. So I think that's very clear. And I think right here we have more from one of our associates, Dr. Ned Rosinski, but I'd like to bring Dennis up and just see what thoughts you have on hearing what we've just heard.
I think that you have to consider several things here. People should remember that in the United States, in the late 1990s, there was a very extensive discussion about how the George Bush administration of 1988 to 92 and the prior Reagan administration, in which George Bush was the vice president, involved themselves in, through the war in Nicaragua, cocaine trafficking, and other such activity. In the 90s, this was in particular exposed by Gary Webb, who became one of the first people to ever use the internet to put all of his research up on the internet, which you were able to download essentially in the real time as he put it up, more or less. And this was 1996, 97, 98. This is notable because it's only 3 years before the invasion of Afghanistan. Notably, Webb was destroyed as a journalist, as people know, and later was said to have, is alleged to have committed suicide. There are those who doubt that that's exactly what occurred, but that is the official conclusion. Now, in 2001, we have to remember that what happened during 2000 was that the dot-com bubble began to come apart during the year 2000, and by early 2001, there was already a crisis. Matter of fact, there were multiple crises with respect to the stock market and so forth. Drug production and the financing involved with it had been integrated into the system during the 1970s and early 80s. And our organization had written a book called Dope Incorporated back in 1979, beginning those researches as Jimmy Carter came into office in 76. That book was reprinted several times during the 1980s. And one of the major contentions we had was that the Bush war on drugs, sometimes called the Reagan war on drugs, it was run by George Bush, was actually a massive expansion of the drug traffic. The war in Afghanistan, the war against the Soviet Union of 1979, which is when the United States sort of got in there, involved a large money laundering operation called BCCI, Bank for Credit and Commerce International, which was set up operating primarily out of Pakistan, but also run by Clark Clifford, another crony of George Bush and significant person at that time in the Republican Party. So one thing that has to be considered as you look at the exit from Afghanistan and the extraordinary freakout coming from the British, who were responsible for patrolling Helmand province, which is in the southwest, I believe, of Afghanistan. But the British forces were charged with patrolling that area. That's where all of the opium comes from. Whether or not what we're really hearing and seeing is a major, deep freakout by the fact that the Taliban forces are likely to proceed as they did in working with Mr. Arlaki and shut down that entire portion of the global drug traffic. There's a longer story with this. Yeah.
There's something I'd like to raise now because, and I'm sure you have also thoughts on this, which is the question of what went with that increase of the drug trade, which was the privatized prisons. That is, many people, I think, associate a war on drugs with the mass incarceration of millions of Americans, leading us to become the #1 nation in the country of people in prison per capita. But I think this is really part of the policy of destruction of the country.
Where you deindustrialized the country in the 1980s. That's what's important to think about. We blew up our steel factories, for example. We deindustrialized Detroit. So as you did that, you also had to do something about elements of the workforce, especially those who had entered the workforce in the period of the 1960s and 70s. The drug business allowed you to do several things at once. If you needed money for special operations, which were off the reservation, whether that was, for example, famously the Nicaragua War was financed clandestinely. The US Congress forbade the Reagan administration from financing that war. So they found a way to finance it. And the way they financed it was through the money that came from a combination of weapons sales and drug sales. Remember, it's Iran-Contra, so it's also got another component when that has to do with, if you look at where Iran is, which is on the border of Afghanistan, you look at Pakistan on the border of Afghanistan, and you look at where the drug money laundering operations had to be set up. Because remember, this was a period before internet. There was no cyber economy of the type that we think about now. So a lot of this stuff had to be done by getting into a location, actually selling a product, actually getting the cash, then figuring out a way to launder it. So you needed people for that. And that meant that you could recruit people, including in the streets, for that purpose. But there was also an issue as to doing a kind of a recycling of the workforce. But the other thing this says say about this is that most of the people perpetrating this have never been prosecuted, because most of them are bankers. Most of them are not street people. Most of them are people who are citizens above suspicion. Most of them are people that hang out in places like Silicon Valley. That's what the actual perpetration of this trade is. And that's the people that were stopping Mr. Arlaki from his initiative. Certainly when you talked about the warlords, you referenced that. Rumsfeld meeting with the warlords, but not with the Taliban. And the warlords are the people that ran the drug trade. That's exactly why we had the problem, in part, with the Afghanistan military. It wasn't the military. The problem is we have a problem because the warlords are deeply hated in Afghanistan because of their operations with respect to the drug traffic. There's a big heroin addiction problem. This is an Islamic country, very religious, that has a great sort of social stigma. Being a drug addict is not something that people are proud of. So I think that what you've shown from him and his own views of this are really important that people consider as we look at what's unfolding in the decision that Biden took to complete the American withdrawal, which Donald Trump had started. I think that's a very important thing. And I think it's just important for everybody to reflect on something that may be far uglier that you're going to find out if you decide to face it, namely that the United States military was being used to run drugs from Afghanistan together with the British military, and that there were people that opposed that and decided that that should come to an end, and that the military mission was not there because we were trying to prevent terror, but because we were trying to prop up a dying financial system, which is the transatlantic financial system.
Right, which Schumer represents. I'd like to just take a minute now and go to some excerpts from a longer report from Ned Rosinski, who is a psychiatrist who's testified in the Senate on the evils of marijuana addiction and has worked extensively on LaRouche's book, Dope Incorporated. So Jose, if you'd like to just play a little bit from that audio clip.
The drug abuse problem is horrendous. It's destroying our nation. It's barged into virtually every community, every segment of the population. Thus far, all attempts to stop drug abuse have failed miserably. And the drug abuse problem simply continues to expand. What can be done about this problem? The LaRouche organization takes aim at this problem from the top down, not the bottom up. The bottom up approach is to go into the streets and arrest the drug dealers, to try to catch the shipments of drugs coming into the country, or to go as far as spraying defoliants on huge fields that are growing plants used for drugs, like poppy for heroin or coca for cocaine. We have been doing this for decades, and it has had no effect. Some people react to this failure by saying, we just might as well give up, legalize the drugs, which will at least prevent some people from going to jail. This is the approach adopted by Chuck Schumer, the senator, as we call him, from Wall Street. He has introduced legislation to legalize marijuana across the entire country. However, we know from experience with states that have legalized marijuana, like Colorado, that following legalization, the use rates of these drugs have skyrocketed. Accidents, including lethal car accidents, have increased, and suicide rates have increased. The justification for this, for all this chaos and mayhem that results from the legalization, is that at least we're not sending people to jail for minor crimes of possession and dealing. What's behind that is the assumption that this is the only thing we can do in the situation. At least we'll reduce some of the harm. Now, in contrast to that approach, the top-down approach of the LaRouche movement goes after the controllers of the worldwide drug cartel. This cartel has a long history of running the drug trade as a business, a very, very nasty business. The LaRouche organization traces the current cartel back most recently to the British Empire waging wars on China. I bring this up to demonstrate the mentality of the people running this empire. What is the mentality? What did Britain do in 1838 and 1860 when they had the opium wars to force opium into China? They had a business which included buying cotton from southern plantation owners in the United States. They would bring that cotton to England, where they would use youth labor, underpaid, and weave it into cloth. England was going through a bankruptcy at this point because they could not compete with continental Europe to produce manufactured goods. So they fell into this nasty business of drug trade. But it goes far, far earlier than that. This is just the latest overt empire drug cartel that I want to reference. So they would make cloth and they would bring it then export it to India. And they would force the Indians to buy the cloth because they ruled India with the British East India Company. And they forbade the people living in India from making cloth under the penalty of having your hands cut off. So the people in India were forced to buy cloth from the British and to pay for it by, according to British demands, growing poppy. The British would then get the poppy, turned into opium, and bring it to China, where they would force China to accept it as an import under the threat of a gun. The Chinese quickly became addicted, as anybody would, when it's forced on them, and succumbed to it. This went on for a while, and the British would then reap huge profits. The central bank that was coordinating this virtual worldwide effort, which included other areas as well as the ones I've discussed, was the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, set up by the Keswicks as a British offshore, what we call offshore bank. And they coordinated the huge sums of money. They were a clearinghouse for the money.
According to UN figures, anyway, the top producer of marijuana in the world is the United States. And the number 3 producer of marijuana is Afghanistan. That's not opium. That's not heroin. But I don't know if people knew that this country is the top producer of marijuana in the world. Now think about that. It's a country that used to pride itself on growing food. And apart from what has been done to the farm sector, which is one problem, consider what that means in terms of what you just heard with respect to the way in which the nation of India was subjugated. It's interesting to think about the United States, which has become increasingly de-industrialized, and you then begin to look at the state of its workforce. The fact that 70,000 people died of overdoses of drugs in 2019, which is about 15,000 people more than died in the entire Vietnam War over 10 years. And you begin to then consider that this effort to legalize marijuana, as it's called, is a different thing. Marijuana usage, for example, in the United States is up 67% between 2019 and 2020. In other words, it went up during, of course, this is COVID and so forth, but it went up 67%. And I understand that the new governor is in New York is intending to expedite the setting up as much of the legal marijuana business as can be set up as quickly as possible. So while some may have thought that this was going to bring improvement, or she was going to bring improvement, doesn't sound like it, at least from the standpoint of her advocacy of the legalized use of marijuana.
Well, I think we should look at the British model for this, because what's really striking is it was the perfect inversion of a Hamiltonian banking policy. Because when Hamilton made a policy, each step, for example, of the credit system of refunding the debt from the American Revolution had embedded within it a means of growth. For example, one group of subscribers to the debt had an option that instead of getting paid back 100%, they would get paid back 2/3 and take the other third in land out west, so that they would be partly repaid, but they would also be developing the rest of the country. So that a Hamiltonian American system approach to physical economy is every step of your system of credit and repayment generates physical economic growth. Whereas the British system, every step is to grind people into the dirt, to promote the slave trade in the United States with the production of cotton and tobacco, to promote child labor under horrific conditions in London, to promote starvation in India and drug addiction in China. And it is the system against which we had the American Revolution. So when you see someone like a Schumer or now Hochul moving to increase, and by the way, last year, the number of drug overdose deaths was 93,000. It massively increased from 2019 to 2020. And because people are depressed, because people are lonely, socially isolated, there's a greater tendency to go for addiction. So it's a very dangerous, not only is legalization a terrible idea, but you're doing it at a time when people are the most vulnerable. Now, contrary to the lies, and the mass media really kills me because they make up something and then they repeat it and everyone says it's true just because it appeared in the press when it's a total lie, a lot like they did with Russiagate and these other things. So Schumer always says 80% of the American people support marijuana legalization. He never says where that figure comes from. I certainly don't think that 80%, that is just not the case. In the people that you meet on the street, it's just not the case. Too many people have seen the escalation from marijuana to other drugs to overdoses and the damage that marijuana does, especially the 99% THC, where you have young people committing suicide, committing horrible, grisly homicides, going psychotic. But at any rate, in New Jersey, I was reading that apparently 71% of the towns have opted out of having marijuana dispensaries. And I do want to say publicly on my symposium, in the state of New York, municipalities have until December 31st, 2021, you have December 31st this year, to opt out. And every city and town in this state should opt out of being one of Schumer's drug slaves. We should not have these dispensaries anywhere, and we should just expose the lie It is simply not. And I got that, by the way, when I had my little interruption of Chuck Schumer. I can't remember if it was a response on Facebook or someone in the crowd yelling at me that 80% of Americans support the legalization of marijuana. I just think there's no evidence to support that.
Well, also the fact of the matter is that if 99% of Americans supported the legalization of marijuana, the question involved is, what does it mean? I mean, is this to improve the mental conditions of Americans' kids? Which, I mean, if you can see, we know, for example, the Colorado case was pointed out. But remember, we're also talking not only about higher THC content, we're also talking about synthetic marijuana. We're also talking about edibles. We're talking about all sorts of things which come in all sorts of ways. There's no way to actually police it effectively once you've done it, because police can't do anything about it. Then you say, well, people have to do it responsibly. But how responsible can people be? Take the unfortunate person that was 46-year-old so-called CEO who was doing backflips City Field a couple of nights ago at a Grateful Dead concert. He'd been smoking dope, marijuana. He'd been dropping acid, and he'd been drinking. So he does a backflip right off the embankment there or whatever. Kills himself. So was he behaving responsibly? You say, well, he wasn't responsible. Well, he was a CEO of a liquor company, and he had employees, and they were in 11 different states and so forth. He's not. Isn't he ever? That's the point. Is that becomes what happens because you're dealing with addiction. You're not dealing with what people think we're dealing with here. Not to mention also how it then affects how people deliberate in government. After all, there's a useful, interesting question as to what percentage of the Congress regularly smokes marijuana. Do we know? And does that affect their deliberations on various things? Are we saying nobody in the Congress smokes marijuana? We know that's not true from Kamala Harris. Matter of fact, we know from Barack Obama's birthday party that he's got people sitting right up there in the birthday party smoking blunts. So does this, right?
No, de Blasio is a good poster child for that. Apparently he's smoking all the time.
Well, judging from his decisions.
Yeah. No, it's really insane. I think what we have to do is move for a program. Americans have come to accept that, like Arlaki said, everyone says you can't solve it. Well, you can solve it. They almost shut down the opium production in Afghanistan by working with the Taliban, the very thing that Tony Blair is hysterical about the potential of right now. The United States has, I saw this picture in the New York Times where they were showing half the country has floods, half the country is on fire. Well, hello, how about a massive water management project like Nawapa and similar projects on the East Coast? What is required to create a workforce that can build these things? I've been promoting the Outer Harbor Gateway, this massive storm surge barrier designed by Halcrow, which completed the St. Petersburg Gate, which is 3 times longer, which protected St. Petersburg from one of their century storms in 2012. Their city was protected. Was New York City protected, the great haven of drug money laundering, Lower Manhattan? No, they got clobbered by a double surge coming in from Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean. Could have all been avoided had this project been built when it was proposed in 2009. And if everyone is on drugs, who is going to be the workforce to do this? But I would also say conversely, if children had assignments in the school to design new cities, to think about what's required to sustain human life, to have an idea of what it would be like to terraform the moon or Mars, or make the deserts bloom. If children were actually working on this with the idea that they could have a career dedicating the rest of their life to making the discoveries that would make it possible for mankind to massively improve our standard of living here with billions more people on the planet and expand to other galaxies, I think they wouldn't be that interested in smoking pot or getting high or killing themselves.
Well, I think there's another kind of way to think about the entire reason why people keep being told that you can't do anything about this. It's not the issue as to whether or not people will willingly simply commit suicide because they have nothing better to do. That's sort of a very, very middle class way of looking at the problem. The truth of the matter is that the drug business in various of its permutations is integral to what people keep calling terrorism. Some people talk about it as state-sponsored terrorism. Well, of course, yes, terrorism is used by states for various forms of, shall we say, informal negotiation with other states. This is true. And certainly, if you look at Afghanistan today, I mean, all of the states in that area, Pakistan, for example, certainly China, and others have been not only plagued by the effects of this, it's also been the case that this has gone on over a very, very long period of time. So actually, everybody's got a vested interest in working together to deal with it, except for those people who are part of the banking sector who recognize that there is no longer a serious productive economy in the transatlantic sector. For example, there's no lending going on from this massive amount of liquidity, the several trillions dollars that people heard about from last year that began to go out in terms of the attempts to keep the system propped up around the so-called stimulus package. That money's not being lent to businesses. What's happening is that businesses are being collapsed. Why? Because that money that was being made available from the Federal Reserve is actually keeping the value of no good debt held by the banks so that the banks, quote, stay solvent because the system's actually bankrupt. Now, therefore, if you cut off any significant flow of liquidity, including from particularly drug money, into the system, which is a reliable income stream, right? Housing is no longer a reliable income stream, not big enough to be able to sustain the system. Student loans and that kind of stuff don't represent an income stream that can do that. The one thing that could represent that is an expanded drug addiction process, because the more people they have addicted, the more people are going to feel compelled to basically consume. Therefore, they're going to pay. Therefore, that's a more reliable income stream. That's exactly what's going on. And since, in fact, the notion is that people are useless, that they have a carbon footprint that they needs to be reduced, then what you begin to do is recycle the people, consume the people, cannibalize the people. And you use drug addiction as a way of having them pay you for killing them. But what it also does is it props up this system. And I think, this, if you mess that up, as has just been done by Biden's insisting on us abiding by the timeline in Afghanistan. But it's Afghanistan. It's where you got opium production and marijuana production and a lot of revenue, which is not in Afghanistan. They don't get the revenue. The revenue's in Europe. The revenue's in the United States. The revenue's in the transatlantic banking sector. That's who's penalized. And that's why so many people, particularly in England, are so much in an uproar about what's happening. I think that's the way for us to think about how this drug traffic issue really works. They really don't care about how many people get addicted or how many people are using or whether or not people would stop or wouldn't stop. They could care less about that. What they care about is maintaining the integrity of a dying financial system as they puff their chests out and talk about the great freedom and democracy that they offer the world. But of course, you don't have any real physical production any longer coming out of so many of these countries, including the US.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's worth reflecting on the life and occupation of Jeffrey Epstein, which I'm not going to dwell on, but that is not a unique case. That is the culture of this financial oligarchy, of Wall Street, of these big banks. And people want to respect that. There is nothing respectable there. Franklin Roosevelt used to talk about something, the dignity of labor, that people who actually produce in the physical world have a a conception of their own immortality because they're doing something which is not for themselves, but for future generations. And that is the principle of a legitimate nation state, as LaRouche identified it, the principle of the general welfare, not only for us, but for our posterity. So I think I'd like to conclude this program. Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you, Jose, for doing the audio visual. And everybody, we will see you next Friday. But remember, if you're in New York, get to your city, your village, your town, your municipality, and opt out of the marijuana dispensary program. You have till December 31st to do it.